Picture yourself walking through the narrow, torch-lit streets of Rome's most notorious district, where music, laughter, and the clatter of drinking vessels fill the air. You glance inside a crowded brothel and suddenly freeze. There, behind the smeared makeup and cheap silks, you recognize a face that should never be in such a place. Your heart pounds as you realize who it island. This isn't just some desperate courtesan. It's Livia Marcellina, the Empress of Rome, wife of Emperor Claudianus. Not dragged here against her will, but choosing this life, eager to outdo the very prostitutes who lined these streets. You thought you knew Roman depravity? What you're about to hear makes even Caligula seem tame. Because Rome's third empress didn't merely indulge in excess, she twisted her sexuality into a weapon, destabilizing an empire and sealing her own horrific fate. The story begins in 39 CE, when Rome celebrated a marriage that seemed perfect in every way. Livia Marcellina, just 15 years old, was wed to Emperor Claudianus. The union appeared to embody everything the Romans revered: nobility, fertility, and divine lineage. She was young, radiant, descended from a patrician family whose roots stretched back to the earliest days of the Republic. She was expected to give Rome legitimate heirs and to stand as the ideal of womanly virtue. Claudianus, 13 years her elder and afflicted with a physical disability that modern medicine identifies as a form of cerebral palsy, considered himself fortunate to have secured such a bride. Contemporary descriptions praise Marcellina's appearance: pale complexion, golden hair, refined aristocratic features, everything Rome's ideals of beauty demanded. She fulfilled her duties flawlessly, presenting 2 children to the imperial household and standing at her husband's side in official ceremonies with the dignity of a model empress. Roman society was uncompromising when it came to women's roles. At the top stood the virtuous matron, the wife and mother who embodied chastity, loyalty, and dignity. At the very bottom lurked prostitutes and entertainers, tolerated but despised. For an empress, the contrast was absolute. She was expected to embody virtue so perfectly that even the faintest rumor of impropriety could weaken the throne itself. And that is why Marcellina's double life was not just scandalous, it was dangerous. Behind the marble columns of the Palatine Palace, a darker truth was unfolding. The smiling hostess who welcomed ambassadors at banquets was also a young woman restless under the suffocating protocols of court life. In her first year as empress, servants began noticing odd behaviors. She dismissed her guards at unusual hours, claiming fatigue. Later, she would emerge disguised, clad in plain garments that concealed her identity. At first, these excursions seemed like harmless rebellion, a girl eager for freedom beyond the palace walls, but soon her wanderings turned into something far more calculated. She began studying the practices of Rome's prostitutes, their methods, their territories, their clientele. She wasn't just curious, she was learning. The first recorded episode occurred during the Saturnalia festival of 41 CE, when traditional roles were inverted and rules of morality were temporarily suspended. While Claudianus attended the solemn rituals, Marcellina slipped into the Subura, the capital's infamous red light quarter, disguised as a commoner. That night would change everything. Accounts say she approached a brothel master and asked to work under anonymity for a single night. Believing her to be just another wealthy woman seeking adventure, the proprietor agreed, but what followed astounded everyone present. Marcellina didn't just participate, she dominated. She entertained more clients than the most seasoned workers, her appetite shocking even those accustomed to Rome's extremes. When dawn broke and the other women retired, Marcellina refused to stop. She demanded more men, more challenges, determined to prove she could outlast them all. Only when the brothel keeper forced her out did she finally leave, but she carried something far more dangerous back to the palace, a taste of power through humiliation. From then on, her secret obsession became a nightly ritual. Within months, she had constructed an intricate system to sustain her double life. Trusted servants disguised her, smuggled her from the palace, and shielded her identity with fabricated names. But ordinary prostitution wasn't enough. She turned it into competition, wagering vast sums that she could outlast Rome's most celebrated courtesans. Soon, these contests became public spectacles among the elite. Wealthy spectators gathered to watch their empress unknown to the crowds at first, later whispered in horror to pit herself against professionals in contests of endurance. The most infamous of these took place in 42 CE. Marcellina challenged Sylla, Rome's most renowned courtesan, to see who could entertain the most men in a single night. The rules were stark. From sunset to dawn, the winner would be the woman who serviced the highest number of clients. Nobles packed the venue, eager to gamble on the outcome. Scylla, with years of experience, managed 25 clients before exhaustion overcame her. She bowed out, confident of victory, but the Empress kept going. She surpassed 30 men before the supply of volunteers finally ran dry. Her triumph was not met with cheers, but with a stunned, horrified silence. Because what Rome had just witnessed was not desperation, it was choice. Their Empress, the most powerful woman in the known world, embraced degradation as performance. The greater the gap between her public virtue and private debasement, the more intoxicating it became for her. This was no longer rebellion. This was pathology, and the consequences for Rome would be devastating. Because these contests were only the beginning, what Marcellina set in motion next would not just scandalize her city, it would threaten the very stability of the empire itself. And if you think this is the worst of it, wait until you hear how the Empress turned her obsession into an organized system of corruption. Before we dive into that, make sure you subscribe and let me know where in the world you're watching from. It still amazes me that people everywhere share this same fascination with the darkest corners of history. In the next part, we'll uncover how Marcellina built a secret enterprise that ensnared senators, generals, and merchants alike, using lust as a tool of blackmail and control. What she created was more dangerous than any army Rome had ever faced. By 43 CE, the Empress's hunger for thrill had outgrown secret contests in shadowy taverns. Marcellina wanted more than endurance battles with prostitutes. She wanted an empire under her control, and she had devised the perfect weapon. The plan was audacious. She would transform her secret knights into a permanent system, not just as a participant, but as the architect of Rome's most dangerous underground empire. Sources suggest that in early 43 CE, she established what later chroniclers described as a palace within the city, a lavish villa disguised as a private salon near the Campus Martius. Outwardly, it looked like an elite social club for senators and patricians, but behind its marble doors lay the most infamous brothel Rome would ever know, operated by the Empress herself. And she did not stock it with common women. She coerced noble daughters and wives of senators into serving, forcing them with threats of financial ruin or charges of treason against their families. To the public, these gatherings seemed like harmless banquets or private religious rites. But to the participants, they were cages of humiliation from which there was no escape. Her genius lay in selection. Unlike the Subura brothels that welcomed anyone with a coin, Marcellina targeted only Rome's elite: senators, generals, wealthy merchants. Each encounter was carefully recorded. Servants hidden behind walls transcribed conversations, memorized weaknesses, and documented every compromising detail. The Empress was no longer seeking pleasure alone, she was building a network of blackmail. Think about it. A senator who opposed Claudianus's policies suddenly discovered his son accused of corruption. A merchant dodging taxes found himself miraculously spared if he bent to the Empress's will. A general with dreams of rebellion soon kept silent after realizing his own indiscretions had been witnessed by the very woman who shared Rome's throne. Through this system, Marcellina knew more about Rome's leadership than the emperor himself. She knew which commanders were loyal, which merchants cheated the state, which senators whispered treason in private. She didn't just control the bedroom, she controlled the empire's future. And yet, secrecy was never enough for her. By 44 CE, the Empress began escalating, turning her villa gatherings into grand spectacles. She cloaked them as sacred festivals to Roman gods, ensuring senators and their wives could not refuse attendance. What began as ritual dinners soon descended into staged debauchery. Participants thought they were honoring ancient fertility rites. In reality, they were being stripped of dignity, forced into scenes of shame while scribes recorded every detail. Marcellina understood something more sinister than anyone before her. That shared disgrace was stronger than loyalty. Once compromised together, senators, nobles, even generals would never expose her for fear of destroying themselves. Foreign envoys soon noticed the change. Ambassadors wrote of senators who seemed strangely hesitant, commanders who appeared nervous in the presence of the Empress. Decisions that should have been debated in the Senate were instead quietly dictated by Marcellina's will. Trade routes shifted. Military appointments favored her chosen candidates. Even Rome's foreign policy tilted toward men who owed their survival to her silence. The empire itself was being reshaped in the shadows of her villa, but the darkest turn was yet to come. Palace records hint at her recruitment of adolescent sons and daughters of prominent families under the guise of sacred authenticity. Parents, already ensnared by shame, could do nothing. To resist meant exposing their own sins. To comply meant offering their children to degradation. Rome's most sacred bonds, marriage, parenthood, political trust, were twisted into chains of control. By 46 CE, Marcelina had become untouchable. Her web of blackmail stretched across every level of Rome's ruling class, and her appetite for control only deepened. Chroniclers speak of orchestrated humiliations where her rivals were paraded before guests, stripped not only of clothes but of authority. Senators who once thundered in debate now found themselves groveling in front of colleagues, their voices silenced forever. She had discovered a form of punishment more effective than execution: humiliation without end. Rome's rulers no longer governed by law or reason, they governed by fear of exposure. But for Marcelina, domination was never enough. By 47 CE, secrecy no longer thrilled her. She began hosting public spectacles, masquerading as civic festivals, where whole assemblies of Rome's nobility were compelled into scenes of ritualized debauchery. Imagine the Forum, once a stage for politics and law, now echoing with the sounds of orchestrated humiliation. The Empress stood at the center, guiding the chaos, her power reaching its zenith. She had bent senators, generals, and aristocrats into submission, not by sword, but by shame. Yet even at her height, her obsession pushed her further. For when Claudianus departed Rome in 48 CE to oversee grain supplies in Ostia, Marcelina committed the act that would seal her doom. She staged her greatest spectacle yet, a wedding, not symbolic, not secret, but a full Roman marriage ceremony. Her chosen groom, Gaius Silanus, a young senator renowned for his beauty. Before priests, witnesses, and officials, she declared herself divorced from Claudianus and bound herself to Silanus in holy matrimony. Rome's elite were forced to attend, trapped in a carnival of betrayal that stretched into days of feasting and ritualized excess. The Empress no longer cared for secrecy. She was making a statement. She, not Claudianus, would rule Rome. At first, Silanus reveled in his fortune, but soon he realized he was ensnared in her fantasy, a puppet in her dream of overthrowing the emperor himself. By the time he sought escape, it was too late. News reached Claudianus in Ostia through loyal freedmen who risked everything to tell the truth. At first, the emperor refused to believe it. Even for Marcelina, such treachery seemed unimaginable. But documents, witnesses, and even reports of the wedding itself forced him to face reality. What followed was swift and merciless. Claudianus marched back to Rome, flanked by loyal troops, and stormed the gardens where Marcelina still celebrated her marriage. Chroniclers describe her reaction, first disbelief, then defiance, and finally terror, as she realized her empire of shame had crumbled. There was no trial, no appeal, only execution. But her destruction did not end with death. Claudianus invoked Rome's ultimate punishment, damnatio memoriae. Her name was carved out from monuments, her images destroyed, her memory forbidden to be spoken. The empress who once sought to be remembered as Rome's supreme temptress was erased, condemned to oblivion. Her fall stands as one of history's darkest warnings. That power wielded through shame and corruption corrodes not only rulers, but entire nations. For a time, she bent Rome to her will. But in the end, even the empire's greatest manipulator discovered that no one escapes the weight of their own excess. If this has left you stunned, know this: Marcelina's tale is not unique. History hides many rulers who weaponized lust, fear, and humiliation. Click the video now appearing on your screen to uncover another forbidden chapter one authorities tried to bury. And don't forget to subscribe to join us as we reveal the shadows behind civilization's brightest facades. When news of Marcelina's so-called wedding reached the emperor, Rome stood on the brink of chaos. For years, senators and nobles had endured her humiliations in silence, chained by fear of exposure. But a public marriage to another man while Claudianus still reigned, that was no longer scandal, it was treason. At first, Claudianus could hardly believe it. Loyal freedmen brought him word in Ostia, where he was supervising Rome's fragile grain supply. He dismissed it as rumor, a grotesque exaggeration of his wife's eccentricities. But when witnesses arrived carrying contracts signed in official ink, when priests who had performed the vows confessed in terror, the emperor's disbelief curdled into fury. He returned to Rome not as a grieving husband, but as a ruler facing rebellion. His first act was to summon the Senate. Normally a body divided by endless debate, it was now united in fear. Even her staunchest allies, men who had attended her gatherings and profited from her manipulations, turned against her. They knew that siding with the empress meant sharing her fate. As Claudianus approached the city, Marcellina still reveled in her triumph. Chroniclers describe her in the gardens of her new husband's villa, draped in purple, presiding over feasts that stretched deep into the night. She had begun referring to Silenus as emperor and herself as his rightful consort, convinced that blackmail alone could secure her crown. But she had miscalculated. Fear can bind men for a time, but once survival demands betrayal, loyalty dissolves instantly. Her network of compromised nobles crumbled. Servants who once smuggled her from the palace now abandoned her. Allies melted away, rushing to Claudianus with confessions and accusations in hopes of saving themselves. The confrontation was swift. Soldiers stormed the villa, cutting through gardens where half-drunk guests staggered in panic. Marcellina fled into the colonnades, pleading with guards who had once bowed before her, but no one intervened. Accounts differ on her final moments. Some claim she begged for mercy, promising to renounce Silenus and return to the emperor's side. Others insist she stood defiant, spitting curses at the men who seized her. What all sources agree on is this: her death was not drawn out. Claudianus ordered execution without delay, refusing even to see her face again. Yet her true punishment was not death, but erasure. Rome had a ritual older than the empire itself, damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. It was the ultimate obliteration, worse than any torture, a decree that a person's very existence be struck from history. Marcellina's statues were shattered, her portraits defaced, her name chiseled from inscriptions. Public documents that once carried her seal were burned. Even speaking, her name became a crime. The woman who had tried to immortalize herself as Rome's supreme temptress was reduced to whispers and shadows, a ghost haunting the footnotes of historians. But if Rome succeeded in blotting her out, why do we still know her story today? Because memory, like desire, cannot be fully controlled. Palace servants carried tales to their descendants. Senators who had once trembled in her villa recorded secret memoirs, hiding them in scrolls passed down through families. Foreign observers, appalled by what they had seen, preserved fragments in distant archives. And above all, scandal has a way of surviving when honor cannot. Through these fragments, we glimpse not just a woman's downfall, but a society rotting from within. Marcellina may have orchestrated the shame, but Rome itself provided the stage. The rigid hierarchy that placed empresses at the peak of virtue while condemning prostitutes to the lowest rank made her double life both shocking and intoxicating. The obsession with appearances created the very weapon she wielded: shame. And shame, once unleashed, proved more powerful than law or sword. Senators who once commanded legions bowed to her in fear of exposure. Generals who could have staged coups were silenced by the threat of scandal. For nearly a decade, the empire itself was bent beneath the weight of secrets scribbled in her ledgers. Her fall reminds us of something unsettling: that power is not always sustained by armies or wealth, but by psychology. Rome's legions conquered provinces, but Marcellina conquered Rome's heart through corruption, humiliation, and desire. It is tempting to dismiss her as a singular monster, an aberration in history. But look closer. How many rulers since her time have built empires on the exploitation of secrets? How many governments even today manipulate through surveillance, coercion, and exposure? Marcellina's story is not just ancient gossip, it is a mirror held to every age. Because what destroyed her was not excess alone, it was the arrogance of believing that humiliation could be wielded forever without consequence. In the end, fear breaks, shame fades, and power built on degradation collapses. When Claudianus ordered her memory erased, he was not merely punishing a wife, he was cleansing his empire of a sickness that had nearly consumed it. But history has a way of preserving what states try hardest to bury. And so, through the fragments, we see her still, a girl of 15 who became an empress, who turned lust into a weapon, who nearly brought an empire to its knees, and who paid the ultimate price. If you thought Rome's decadence ended with Marcellina, you'd be mistaken. What came after her would plunge the empire into even darker spectacles of corruption and cruelty. And some of those stories make her reign look almost restrained. In the next part, we'll explore how her legacy set the stage for even more perverse rulers, and how her methods of control were echoed and magnified by the emperors and empresses who followed. What Rome tried to erase, history turned into a pattern, and that pattern would haunt the empire for centuries. The gardens where Marcellina's wedding feast once echoed fell silent after her execution. Statues toppled, silks burned, scrolls destroyed, but the shadow she cast across Rome lingered long after her body was gone. For Claudianus, her death was both relief and humiliation. He had been mocked as a weak emperor, tolerated only because of his lineage. Now, the world knew that his own wife had nearly replaced him with another man while he still lived. The stain on his authority could not be erased, even by wiping her memory from marble and bronze. And yet, paradoxically, Marcellina's downfall strengthened his rule. By condemning her, he reaffirmed his control over Rome. Senators who had once smirked behind his back now groveled before him, terrified of sharing her fate. The spectacle of her erasure sent a clear message. Betrayal, no matter how veiled in pleasure, would be met with merciless justice. But beneath that surface of order, Rome itself had changed. The empire had seen what no society can easily forget, that its rulers were not gods, not paragons of virtue, but flesh and weakness wrapped in purple robes. The illusion of divine dignity had cracked, and once the mask slipped, it could never fully be restored. Historians debate whether Marcellina was a monster of lust or a victim of her world's contradictions. On one hand, she wielded shame like a blade, reducing senators, generals, and even children to pawns in her obsessions. On the other, she lived in a society that trapped women in rigid roles, saintly matrons or degraded prostitutes, with no space in between. Perhaps her rebellion was born from suffocation, an attempt to seize power in a system designed to deny her any. But whatever her motivations, her methods poisoned Rome. She showed that fear of exposure was stronger than loyalty, that blackmail could govern more effectively than law, that shame could enslave even the most powerful. In doing so, she created a template others would follow. Because Marcellina was not the end, she was the beginning. After her, Rome would witness emperors who indulged in even greater depravity. Nero, who forced senators to watch grotesque performances and punished dissent with theatrical cruelty. Commodus, who paraded himself as a gladiator in the Colosseum, blurring the line between ruler and spectacle. Elagabalus, whose sexual extravagances and religious excess shocked even a jaded empire. Each, in their own way, echoed the lesson Marcellina had written in flesh, that power unrestrained by morality becomes performance, and performance becomes control. Her story also reveals something darker about human nature itself. Why did so many powerful men obey her? Not only because they feared exposure, but because scandal thrilled them as much as it thrilled her. They laughed at her feasts, they bet on her contests, they whispered about her disguises. In condemning her, Rome was condemning itself, and maybe that is why the Senate so eagerly embraced her erasure. By deleting her memory, they tried to delete their own complicity. By destroying her statues, they hid their own shame. But history is not so easily silenced. Even centuries later, whispers of the Empress survived. Chroniclers like Tacitus, Juvenal, and Cassius Dio preserved fragments of her scandal, often cloaking them in moral lessons, but unable to resist the lurid details. In the Middle Ages, monks copied these accounts with trembling hands, horrified yet fascinated. And today, her name still provokes shock, curiosity, and uneasy fascination. Because deep down, we recognize something timeless in her tale. Strip away the togas, the marble, the Latin phrases, and what remains? The same games of power, humiliation, and secrecy that play out in every age. Rulers still weaponize scandal, governments still wield shame as a tool, leaders still fall when secrets spill into the open. Marcellina's life reminds us that history's darkest stories are not just about the past. They are warnings about what happens when lust for control overrides every boundary, when shame is turned into currency, when pleasure becomes politics. Her fate was sealed not by her appetites alone, but by her arrogance. She believed she could rewrite the rules of empire, that she could dethrone an emperor with humiliation instead of swords. For a moment, she almost succeeded. But history has a way of punishing those who confuse spectacle with stability. When Claudianus ordered her condemned to oblivion, he believed he was protecting Rome. But in truth, he had only revealed how fragile imperial authority had become. From that moment forward, no emperor's dignity was unquestionable. Every rumor, every whisper, carried the potential to topple the throne. And so, the empress who sought immortality through excess achieved it another way, not in statues or triumphs, but in cautionary tales. She became the embodiment of Rome's decadence, the name whispered whenever people asked, "How far can power fall?" In the end, she did outlast her rivals. Sylla, the famed courtesan she defeated in contests of endurance, is remembered only as a footnote to her story. The senators she blackmailed vanished into anonymity. But Marcellina remains, carved not into marble, but into memory the empress erased, yet never forgotten. Her story ends in silence, but its echoes continue. Because whenever we study the collapse of empires, we return to the same truth. Corruption does not always wear armor. Sometimes it wears silk, sometimes it smiles behind painted lips. And sometimes, the deadliest weapon is not the sword, but the secret. If this story unsettled, you know that history holds many more like it. Click the video now on your screen to uncover another forbidden chapter 1 the ancients tried to bury. And if you haven't already, subscribe to join us on this journey into the shadows of civilization, where the past is never as noble as it pretends to be. The execution of Marcellina silenced her voice, but not her influence. For even erased figures leave behind a vacuum, and that vacuum shapes what comes after. Rome was forced to reckon with what her reign of scandal revealed. That shame was as dangerous a weapon as any legion. After her death, Claudianus attempted to restore dignity to the imperial household. He filled the palace with statues of gods, increased public ceremonies, and elevated his children as symbols of stability. But the empire had seen too much. The whispers did not vanish, they simply shifted. Every banquet, every ceremony, senators asked themselves, who will be the next to fall under the weight of secrets? And they were right to ask. Because Marcellina's methods, blackmail, manipulation, spectacle, did not die with her. Instead, they were absorbed into the bloodstream of imperial politics. Later rulers studied her story as both warning and inspiration. Some tried to avoid her mistakes, others imitated them openly. Consider Nero, who ascended to the throne only a few years after her downfall. He forced senators to perform humiliating roles in his plays and concerts, their fear of disgrace binding them more tightly than loyalty ever could. Was this not Marcellina's strategy reborn, wielded by an emperor rather than an empress? Or Elagabalus, 2 centuries later, who hosted orgiastic festivals cloaked in religious ritual, compelling Rome's elite to witness or participate in spectacles that blurred the line between piety and depravity. In his performances, we see an echo of Marcellina's so-called sacred feasts, where ritual masked humiliation. Even Commodus, striding into the Colosseum as a gladiator, turned power into performance, forcing Rome to watch as its emperor degraded himself in the arena. He believed that spectacle was control, the very lesson Marcellina had discovered decades before him. Her story also casts light on something broader, the fragility of empires built on appearances. Rome prided itself on moral discipline, on strict codes dividing virtue from vice. But those very boundaries made transgression intoxicating. By crossing the line between empress and prostitute, Marcellina didn't just break a rule, she shattered the illusion that rulers were above human weakness. That illusion is vital to any empire. Once it cracks, stability falters. Citizens begin to wonder, if our leaders indulge in secret excess, what else do they hide? If our laws can be bent by shame, what do they truly protect? And when those questions spread, the empire's foundation shakes. It is no accident that after Marcellina's death, Rome entered a period of paranoia. Claudianus executed rivals at the faintest rumor of conspiracy. The Senate grew cautious, its members terrified of being caught in new webs of scandal. Trust evaporated. The empire survived, but it was weaker, more brittle, more vulnerable to future tyrants. And here lies the lasting power of her story. Marcellina was condemned to oblivion, yet her ghost lingered in every whisper of corruption, in every scandal that haunted the imperial court. Her erasure failed. In fact, it may have guaranteed her immortality. For nothing fascinates the human mind more than what we are told to forget. Even now, centuries later, her tale grips us because it exposes a universal truth, that power and vice are inseparable, that rulers often weaponize secrets, and that shame is both a chain and a sword. So, when we study Marcelina, we are not simply gawking at Rome's excess. We are staring into a mirror. How many modern leaders build their power on secrets, coercion, and hidden scandals? How many governments depend not on loyalty, but on the fear of humiliation? History changes its costumes, but the performance remains the same. Perhaps that is why Rome tried so desperately to erase her. Not only because she humiliated her emperor, but because she revealed a truth too dangerous to admit, that empires are not destroyed by barbarians at the gate, but by corruption festering within their own palaces. Marcelina's body turned to dust nearly 2,000 years ago. Her statues lie in fragments, her name scratched from marble. But her story endures, carried by scandal, preserved by fascination, and retold as both warning and spectacle. Because in the end, she did achieve a form of immortality. Not the one she wanted, not the one sung in triumphal processions, but an immortality forged in infamy. And perhaps that is the darkest lesson of all, that in history, the line between glory and disgrace is as thin as the veil between an empress and a prostitute. If this tale has unsettled you, then know this, it is only one among many. Click the video on your screen to step into another shadowed corridor of history, where forgotten rulers hid sins that make Marcelina's look almost tame. And subscribe, because the past still whispers its secrets, and together we will uncover them.